This is the Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin. He's been in power for 22 years, and for most of that time, he's had complete control over anything that happened in Russia, turning it into the country that it is today. But no dictator stays in power forever, and for Putin, it looks like the clock has started ticking. He is 70 years old, rumored to be suffering from a terminal disease, and periodically disappearing for prolonged periods of time from the public eye for undisclosed reasons. And the failure of his invasion to Ukraine has weakened his previously unshakable position. If he's not able to deliver results after the enormous price that Russia is paying every day on the battlefield, his position will sooner or later become untenable. But whether it'll be because of his health or an external pressure, the question remains. What happens once Putin is forced to step aside? Here are 4 most likely scenarios of what might happen after Putin. But before we continue, I need to tell you about a platform that has accumulated over 600,000 users and delivered amazing returns even during these dire economic conditions. The times we're living in can bring financial uncertainty to everyone. Just this year, we've seen the effects of wars, pandemics, and inflation. And this may be just the beginning, as the S&P 500 could be potentially facing double-digit losses. At times like these, making the right investments can become that much more important, and with inflation still hovering around a record high, your money is losing value as it sits in your account. But at the same time, it's a pretty intimidating time to start investing. But according to the Financial Times, the richest individual investors are maxing out allocations into alternative assets. And in midst of all the meltdown, there is $1 trillion asset class that just had its richest auction season ever. And it's not Bitcoin and it's not NFTs, it's fine art. Due to its near zero correlation to traditional equities, the 1% have been using art to help hedge against inflation and preserve wealth for decades. And with today's sponsor, Masterworks, you can do the same and diversify your investments, but without spending millions on an entire painting. Over 600,000 people have signed up so far, and from the looks of these numbers, you can see why. To meet demand, Masterworks is looking to launch new offerings on a weekly basis, and since they have sold out, there may be a wait. But with the link in the description, you can get priority access, so take a look and try it out. And meanwhile, back to the video. In the first scenario, Putin's regime falls due to a unified pressure of the general public, and it's replaced by a Western-style liberal democracy, with a new leader that would come out of free and transparent elections, and turn Russia into more or less standard European country. Now, this is the scenario that people in the West tend to hope for, but unfortunately, it's also the one that's the least likely to happen. The problem is that, at least at the moment, the democratic opposition to Putin is relatively weak. It lacks organization, structure, leadership, and most importantly, a wide popular support. Over the past decade, the regime has been able to either eliminate, imprison, or forced most of its leaders out of the country. It has successfully suppressed basically all of the independent media, making the pro-democratic opposition basically invisible, and even the most prominent opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who has almost died after being poisoned and is now in prison with no hope of getting out anytime soon, is not actually that appealing to the general Russian public. In 2021, only 14% of Russians supported him, and 30% had no idea who he was, according to a poll by the Levada Center, which is largely considered to have reliable data. And so, even if the number of Russians dissatisfied with Putin might be growing, they don't necessarily have to support the democratic opposition. And statistics and previous examples from other countries support this. Dictatorships and autocratic regimes often fall as a consequence of a failed war, like the military regime in Argentina, which collapsed after losing a war with the UK. But in the majority of cases, they are not replaced by democracies, but by other dictatorships. Studies show that when personalized dictatorships like the one in Russia fall, they are in 80% of cases replaced by another autocratic regime. And even when dictators and autocrats are overthrown by a popular uprising, there is still a 60% probability that they will be replaced by another dictator, based on historic data from across the world. And so even though this would be in many ways the preferred outcome, the chances of Russia becoming a democracy after Putin are fairly slim. And that brings us to a scenario number 2. But if Putin being replaced by a democratic leader is not the most probable outcome, who would take his place instead? Well, one way to answer is by looking at the people surrounding him, because those in his inner circle are those who are closest to the center of power, and they will be in a prime position to replace him once he's gone. And in that case, one of the possible scenarios is what we would call normalization. Basically, in this scenario, Putin will be replaced by someone from the upper echelons of the Russian regime who is slightly more liberal than Putin, and who might at least tone down the insanity that Russia started this year. This new leader would focus on saving the Russian economy from completely falling apart, finding some kind of a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, and maybe even trying to lift some of the sanctions placed on Russia by trying to present it as a rational country. It doesn't mean that Russia would become a democracy, or even give up on its imperial ambitions, but it would normalize the situation, making it similar to what it looked like before the Russian invasion. Now, the problem with this scenario is that there are very few liberals left anywhere near Putin, and that instead, he has surrounded himself by people even more hawkish than him. But still, there are a few potential successors of Putin who would likely represent a shift towards more normalized Russia. These are people like Mikhail Mishustin, the current Prime Minister of Russia, who would be the one automatically taking over presidential powers in case Putin suddenly dies. In his tenure, he has mostly focused on improving the efficiency of the state and administrative reforms, and since the invasion of Ukraine began, he's been tasked with shielding Russia from the impact of Western sanctions. Now, this scenario is possible, but it's unclear how much actual influence the more rational members of the Russian elite have. Because right now, it seems like it's the people leading the military and the security services who are calling the shots, and they would have to agree to put someone moderate in the seat of the president, perhaps in order to calm down the situation. And if that didn't happen, things would move towards scenario number 3. Just like in the previous scenario, Putin is succeeded by someone from his inner circle, except that in this case, it's someone who will continue in Putin's aggressive imperialist foreign policy, or worse, push it to even bigger extremes. And the bad news is that this scenario is also way more likely than the previous 2. Simply because most of the men around Putin with the most influence are considered to be extremely hawkish and fully in support of his decision to invade Ukraine. The man who is considered to be the most likely successor to Putin by a number of experts, including the former chief of MI6, is Nikolai Patrushev. Patrushev is a former head of the FSB, the Russian main intelligence service, and currently he's the secretary of the Russian Security Council. Basically, he's one of the most important people when it comes to Russia's national security, second in influence only to Vladimir Putin, and he shares most of Putin's views. He's been described as the most hawkish hawk and the most dangerous man in Russia, with a paranoid, conspiracy-driven mindset, who's been one of the main advocates of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If he's the one who takes over after Putin, it's almost certain that he will double down on Putin's aggressive foreign policy abroad and crack down on opposition at home. And if it's not him, there are others with similar or even more extreme positions who could also be potential candidates for succession, like Putin's former bodyguard, Alexei Dumin, the current Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, or even the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's becoming more and more prominent and more influential in Russia since the invasion in Ukraine started. But any of these people would be bad news, and they would likely make Russia even more unpredictable, aggressive, and isolated. But there is one more scenario, and one more plausible alternative of what might happen, one with potentially even more dangerous consequences. consequences. In the final scenario, Putin doesn't choose a successor. The people at the top are not able to agree on who should replace him, and two or more different contenders start to fight over the place on the throne, sending Russia into a spiral of internal chaos and violence. Now, this scenario is extreme, but not impossible. Russia has seen a somewhat similar situation not that long ago, in 1993, when a power struggle broke out between the sitting president Boris Yeltsin and the Russian parliament that elected their own president. Back then, it culminated in fights between the Ministry of Interior on one side and the military on the other one, and ended with tanks shooting at the parliament building and hundreds of people killed and wounded. That was less than 30 years ago, and while it may sound extreme, it's not that unimaginable, especially if Russia ends up losing in Ukraine, which would likely cause chaos among both the elite circles and the general population. Putin's ability to stay in power for so long has been described as an art of delicately balancing different factions within the Russian government, always dividing them and putting them against each other while managing to keep everything in relative stability. But with Russia going through an internal chaos in the wake of a lost war, and with Putin gone, this delicate balance would disappear as well. And unless there will be a clear successor, a period of chaos will follow, until a new leader emerges, creating a new balance of power once again.